The Hawk That Dare Not Hunt by Day by Scott Odell, Chapter 30. 3 weeks later, I came down with the sweating sickness myself, but fortunately for me, not in the public pest house. I had the strength to drag myself through the town, down the embankment, and aboard the Black Pearl. A guard was posted at the dock and a red cross painted on the ship's hull, but at least I was safely at home. I remember little of the plague, except that I was always nauseated and that my head felt like a hard green melon that at any time would fly apart into a dozen pieces. I sweated away half my weight and all of my strength. I thought I would die, at times wished that I would, but although more than 6,000 did die during that terrible summer, I managed to survive. Because I believe of the care of my faithful friend, the ship's carpenter, Ed Grote, who lovingly, when he thought I was a goner, made me a proper coffin and lovingly carved an angel upon the oaken lid. It took me until March of that winter to get my strength back, and until May before I felt like venturing forth. It was a nightmarish time, but not all of it lost. For in those days I did 2 things of worth. I learned at last to read the English language, to read it well, and used my new skill during the days and the long hours of the night to read William Tyndale's translation of the New Testament, as I had promised him that I would. During this period of the plague, I never heard from him, but I was sure in the knowledge that he had not yet been captured by the king, although the lowlands and the provinces of Germany and France swarmed with royal and clerical spies. I knew he was alive and free and busy at work because almost weekly Ed Grote bought me pamphlets, still fresh from the printery, that Tyndale had written against his violent enemies in England, those who in their violence called his work a testament written by the devil himself. All during my sickness, I was in touch with Herbert Belsey, who sent me food and fond notes of encouragement. Later, when I was on the mend, he would ask me every few days how soon I was to be able to take the Black Pearl to sea again. I never wrote back. Instead, I always sent word to him by Ed Grote, because Belsey feared that a letter from my hands might carry contamination. I took the ship downriver to the Deptford Boat Works in early summer, removed the cargo of the Bibles, sent them by wherry in the middle of the night across the river, and sold them to a London dealer. The next morning, we began to unstep the old mainmast and set the new one, a beautiful piece of timber, true as an arrow. It was on the day after we had finished with the mast and were giving the hull a heavy coat of tar that my business with the New World Exploration and Trading Company really began. The ship was careened, and I was standing with a tar brush in one hand and a bucket of hot tar sitting nearby when Belsey and Henry Phillips appeared on the bank side above me. They looked out of place amidst all the muck and disorder, dressed as they were in velvet and silk. Ed Grote was working alongside me, and I could tell by the casual way that he began to slap his brush around that nothing would please him more than to slop a little of the tar on the 2 gentlemen in their fine clothes. Phillips shouted down, "What are you up to?" It was obvious what we were up to, but since he was a valued shareholder, I explained that we were coating the hull below the waterline with tar. "What's that accomplish?" he asked. From the tone of his voice, I got the impression that he thought we were just down there wasting time. "The tar keeps worms out of the hull," I explained. "Worms?" he said. "I thought worms burrowed around in the ground." "Earthworms do," I said, "but sea worms burrow in wood. In 2 or 3 months' time, they can chew a hull to pieces. They did it with Columbus's Santa Maria." "In 2 or 3 months, then, you'll have to tar the hull again." "Scrape her down to the wood," I said. "Give her a good sanding and then a thick coat of tar. Then you'll always have a ship-shape hull. This hull is almost 30 years old, and she's as good as the day she was launched." Philip thought about this information for a moment or two. I think you could coat the hull with something more permanent than tar. Save a lot of time and money, I think. Of course, I'm not a sailor. Belsi said, I hear that the Swedes are sheathing their ships with lead. It lasts for years. I've heard of this practice, I said, but it's costly, very costly here in England. Would you use lead if we could get our hands on some? Phillips asked. Certainly, if it didn't cost more than tar. I didn't want the high price of lead to come out of my share of the profits. The ship had gotten along fine for years without lead sheathing. I can get lead cheap, Phillips said. Loads of it. You'd have to melt it down, however. What do you think? I asked Ed Grote, who knew a lot more about sheathing than I did. Melting's not the problem. It's the beating out that takes time. Would it be worth the trouble? I asked. Depends on the lead, Grote said. On the quality, let's say. The best quality, Phillips answered from the bank. There's quality, then there's quality, Ed Grote said. Some soft, some's too hard. Where's this lead come from? A barge went by, and we waited until the waves subsided. Where from? Ed asked again. From an abbey over near Wilton. The king's thinking of tearing it down, and I can buy up a lot of the lead cheap. Where is it coming from? Ed asked. From pipes, roofs, gutters, materials like that? From windows, stained glass windows, frames, I think. That's the best kind, Ed Grote said. That makes fine sheathing, soft, easy to melt down and roll out, easy to handle all around. I stopped painting and looked up at Phillips. I wouldn't want to use lead taken from an abbey, from stained glass windows, I said. Phillips looked surprised. Why? He asked. Lead's lead. It just doesn't seem rightful to use the abbey lead this way. It's the king's command. You wouldn't be against the king's command, would you? No, but I still don't think it's right to tear up a stained window glass and melt down the lead for sheathing. Tar will do, I said, starting to paint again. It has for a long time. I thought you'd be backing the king in this struggle to rid himself of that Spaniard, Carlos. I know he's threatened to take over the monasteries and all their lands, Ed Grote said. I honestly don't know much about the struggle, I said. We had run out of tar, and I picked up a bucket and went over to the iron barrel that was heating over a fire. Phillips strolled up to where I was stirring the bubbling tar, stepping carefully so as not to soil his boots. It surprises me to find you against His Majesty. I'm not against His Majesty, I said. Phillips watched me fill the bucket. Suddenly he said, I always thought you were on the church's side, but from what I've heard, you're against Sir Thomas More. I've heard, too, that you're a friend of Martin Luther's. And that other one, what's his name? He glanced at Belsi for help. Tyndale, Belsi said, William Tyndale. Yes, that's a name, Tyndale. I went down to the beach and began to paint again, working fast because the tide was coming in. By the way, Phillips said, stooping to wipe river mud from his boots, you've seen his Bible, haven't you? Yes, I've seen it, I said, deciding not to tell him that I had read it. Where did you see it? In Antwerp, in London, in Deptford, everywhere I've gone nearly. It's very popular, all right, Phillips said. Do you think we would profit by printing an edition in Antwerp and selling it here? You'd have a right to print it in Antwerp, but it's against the law to bring it into England, I said. I looked up at Philip standing against the bankside, with the wind blowing his blonde hair and the feather in his hat moving about, and I thought again, I've seen this man before. Philip said, still cleaning his boots, he's a law-abider, this young man. About Bibles, said Belsi, smiling his lopsided smile, but about other things, he's not so abiding. If we got a cargo of lead from the Abbey, Philip said, not from the windows, but from roof and gutters, would you take it to Venice? Lead stripped from an abbey, wherever it came from, I'd feel the same about, I answered. The tide was catching the ship, moving it slowly upright. So I pulled out the longboat, and Ed Grote and I got in with our bucket of tar and went on painting the bottom. Belsie and Phillips climbed the bank out of the tide's reach and stood for a while watching us. "When will you be finished with the tar?" Belsie asked. "We'll careen again tomorrow," I said, "and paint the port side. We should be ready in 3 days, by Friday at the latest. Come down to the dock at St. Catherine's Way when you're finished. We'll have a cargo ready for you, not later than Friday evening." They left the bank and walked off through the field towards their horses. "What do you make of them?" Ed Grote asked me. "They're after Tyndale," I said. "What makes you so certain?" "Everything Phillips said." Can he really get lead? It's possible. How about the Bibles he wants to print and bring in? There's already a new printing passing around. It comes from Antwerp, from a printer by the name of Eindhoven. There'll be other printings, but Phillips isn't interested in bringing in Bibles. He's interested in getting his hands on Tyndale. And upon you, Tom, if you bring in a cargo of Bibles. Belsie and Phillips had mounted their horses. As they rode past us, Phillips shouted, "We'll have a cargo of lead for you from Henry's palace." He laughed and waved a gloved hand. It was his laughter that struck fire. It had some of the same harsh, rolling sounds that I had heard once before. Had I heard it on the night in Cologne, when I had come in from eating supper with Tyndale and had happened upon Belsie talking to a man at the street turning? As I had passed them, the man with Belsie had laughed at my horse. Was it the same laughter that I heard now, fading away over the meadow, harsh, cruel, and derisive? End of chapter 30.